Now, let's jump over in these last 15 minutes into some charts. Let's begin to see what this looks like. I've got a Google search for Daniel's 70th week chart. And it doesn't really matter which chart you look at per se. The overall scope of what we're looking at in this final 70th week, which is still future, according to my understanding of prophecy, fits the same for just about every chart. So let me blow that chart up for a little bit. This is from Growing Christian Resources. Daniel's 70 weeks in summary. So let's look at this chart for a split second. Now, remember I talked in my hermeneutic section about different ways to understand prophecy. If you're taking the preterist approach to prophecy, where all prophecy is really basically already fulfilled, and that Daniel's prophecy in Daniel chapter 9 was speaking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, well, then you're not really looking for a final 70th week of Daniel to come and hit the scene as a Christian or anyone like that. You're looking at all of those destructions and desecrations and all of those abominations and all that other stuff, persecution and stuff. You're looking through past history for details that kind of fit the description of what Daniel, and you have to stretch a little bit. I understand the preterist view, in my opinion, is a very weak view to hold to, but still it has some merit. Indeed, if you look through the prophecy, for instance, in Matthew 24, Matthew 25, Mark 13, Luke 17, and Luke 21, these are all prophecies given by Yeshua himself. Most of them were given right there on the Mount of Olives, and we call these the Olivet Discourse prophecies. Matthew 24 and 25, Mark 13, and Luke 17. Those are specifically Olivet Discourse prophecies. Luke 21, however, gives us what we might call the Temple Discourse, where Yeshua is describing some events that are more related to the destruction of the temple and less related to kind of the overall prophetic timetable. And in time, we'll look at this. We'll start doing this next week. But in time, we're going to find out that what Luke wrote down from the mouth of the master himself were details that probably very likely did take place in 70 AD. So it means from the preterist perspective, a lot of Daniel's, not a lot of Daniel's, but a lot of Yeshua's predictive words about when you see the army surrounding Jerusalem, you need to flee, you need to take off, don't go back and get your coat, pray that it's not going to be on Sabbath, pray that you're not pregnant as a woman, pray that it won't be in the winter and things like that. Blah, blah, blah. A lot of those destructive details that were given actually probably took place in 70 AD shortly after Yeshua explaining them to them. In other words, the near-far aspect was more near at that time. But when we compare that part of the Bible, just Luke 21, if I'm pulling this out of memory, right? I could get those swapped. It might be 13, that's the Temple Discourse, and 21, that's the Olivet Discourse, but I think it's the reverse. I think 13 of Luke is the Olivet Discourse, and 21 is the Temple Discourse. I think that's what it is. But if all those details weren't fulfilled in 70 AD, if some of them are indeed for a future time that's still future to us in the 21st century here in 2023, then what we have is an application of a near and a far, right? Yeshua is describing things that took place near to those people right around the corner. They needed those words right then, and there are still future events. So let's look at this 70 weeks of Daniel through the perspective that I myself, this writer, this author, I'm the Bible teacher of this particular YouTube channel and this podcast. This is my perspective, and I'm not the only one who holds this perspective, but this is the futurist perspective with a little bit of help from the historicist and the preterist, meaning realizing that some of this did take place already, and yet a lot of it is still future. So my perspective is that this 70th week of Daniel that we're looking at this chart, and let's just look at some of the details first. We've got a 7-year period of 1 week, which equals 7 years. Remember, Daniel talked about weeks and weeks, and he used the word weeks. In the original Hebrew and Aramaic, can be translated as weeks, or could literally be translated as 7 sevens. But the context is what drives, are we talking about 7 days, or 7 weeks, or 7 years, right? We have to determine from context. And based on the way the events are laid out, we can safely ascertain, even most preterists would agree that some of this has to be spread out over years. It couldn't be literal weeks. Even if parts of it were clumped together in short bursts, and then parts of it are spread out over, like the historicists would say, kind of long, broad stretches. Like I know some Bible teachers, historicists, who believe that we're actually right in the middle of the tribulation, with all of the persecution in the world today, with all of the crazy weather that you see, with all the political unrest and things like that. We just see that the tribulation is kind of spread out over long swath of like decades, rather than clumped all together into a 7-year intense concentrated time frame. I myself am of the impression, just so you don't misunderstand, I'm of the impression that 7 years is actually 7 physical years of 360-day calendar days. In other words, they're 360 prophetic days according to their biblical days. They're not 365-day years when we say 7 years. So we can break this time period up, like you see on the chart, between 3.5 years on one side and 3.5 years on the other side. And let's look at some of the other details. In the chart, it says in the midst of the week, right? We read about that in Daniel 9:27, in the middle of the week. That would cut right down the middle between the 3.5 and 3.5. And then we can see that at the bottom of the chart, it talks about a covenant or a peace treaty that is made in Daniel 9:27 at the very beginning of the 7-year period. In the middle, down at the bottom, you see the arrow right down there in the middle. At the 3.5-year mark, it says the covenant is broken. Daniel 9:27, the abomination of desolation that Yeshua spoke of in Matthew 24:15 takes place. And then, according to this chart, we have the great tribulation on the last half of the 70th week, the last 3.5 years, Matthew 24:21, right? 3.5 years of the great tribulation. And then there's a verse down at the bottom, it's quoted from Yeshua again, after the tribulation of those days, Christ the Messiah will return, Matthew 24:29 through 30. So using just this only, we could begin to talk about the idea of rapture. This is the kind of controversial topic in eschatological discussions. When is Jesus going to return? It's no secret that most Christians, but you'd be surprised to find out that not all, most Christians believe that Jesus' return is still future. There are some Christian groups and denominations who believe that Jesus has already returned, and that his return was a kind of a spiritual return. It wasn't a physical bodily return. My understanding of Scripture and prophecy is that his return is literal, meaning just like his first coming was literal, he came to earth literally, physically, he occupied a human body. He took up real estate space on planet Earth at the time that he was here. He moved in and about humans and spoke and ate and slept like all humans do. I believe that he's going to physically return once again in bodily form, although the second coming of Messiah, I believe, covers not just one event, but multiple either events or multiple kind of time frames. So we could say the initiation of his second coming would be what many Christians refer to as either the rapture or the resurrection. But his feet don't even touch the ground then. We meet him in the air. We read about that in the books of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Paul gives us those details. So Yeshua doesn't even need to touch planet Earth just yet. We meet him in the air. But as we find out from other prophecies, there are other details that take place either with the believers in heaven and or Yeshua returning to earth, such as Zechariah 14, where he comes down to the Mount of Olives, and his feet actually touch the Mount of Olives and split that thing in two from north to south, splits from the north and the south, and there's a big valley that flows between the two. Well, that's a physical touching of planet Earth as opposed to meeting the Lord in the air. And then we also find that when we're going to read about this in certain Old Testament prophecies as well as in the book of Revelation in time, there's this battle that takes place near the very end of the age known as the Battle of Armageddon. And it's fought in the Middle East, probably in this valley that's about 60 miles north of Jerusalem, Har Megiddo. It might be there, it might not be there. At least the namesake is there, Har Megiddo, Battle of Armageddon. The name Armageddon comes from Har Megiddo. Har in Hebrew is mount or hill. So Mount Megiddo or Hill of Megiddo and the plains of Megiddo. You can do a Google search for Megiddo right now, and it'll show you that it's a location, it's a valley in Israel, like I said, about slightly northwest of Jerusalem, or directly maybe north of Jerusalem. So in that battle, the description there is that Yeshua is going to ride a white horse and fight against the Antichrist and Satan's armies that are going to do battle against God and his Messiah, right? Where you can read about this in Psalm chapter 2. We can read about this in certain Jeremiah passages, Ezekiel passages, Joel passages, Revelation passages like 19 and 20 and things like that. And so what we're talking about is that that's still part of the second coming of Messiah, but it's not the same thing as the rapture. So that's my take on that aspect. But if you look at this chart with the little arrows that are pointing down, one at the very beginning of the 70th week, one in the middle of the 70th week, one at the very end, there are folks who hold to a view of rapture that we're going to see here, known as Posttribulationism. And so let's turn now to some different rapture views and talk about that. This is another chart that you can just Google search for. This one's put together by Revelation Mark Hitchcock. Mark Hitchcock would probably be the author's name. And so let's talk about these four views of the timing of the rapture. Within Daniel's 70 weeks, right? Look at that little line running along the very bottom of this chart. You see have the set, it's called Daniel's, I'm sorry, this chart calls it 7 years of tribulation. Remember the previous chart, let me jump back over there for a split second. It calls the Great Tribulation as just the 3.5 years. Is it saying that the whole tribulation is 7 years long? Well, maybe, maybe not. Many Christians are of the impression that the tribulation is 7 years long. Some Christians don't believe it's the full 7 years. Some believe that the first half of that 7-year period is some type of trouble and distress, but it's not necessarily the tribulation. The last 3.5 years is what's called the Great Tribulation, according to that previous chart. This chart says it's the whole 7-year tribulation. Doesn't say anything about the total Great Tribulation, but I'm of the impression that it's more closely the previous chart, that the Great Tribulation is the final 3.5 years, and more specifically, the wrath of God is even the final maybe half of that 3.5 year mark. But in conclusion to this sneak preview tonight, let's just break down this particular chart and use this again to whet our appetite. We could ask the question, when is the rapture? When is the second coming of Messiah? And is there even a rapture? I'm of the impression and understanding that there is a rapture, but it's not secret. So it's popular and vogue in today's Christian circles to throw this idea of rapture under the bus because of the talk of it being secret, like as in imminently, suddenly, without warning, without any precursor, without any expectation, suddenly millions and billions of people are going to disappear from planet Earth in the blink of an eye, and no one's going to know what happened. And it'll be completely secret. No one will have had any warning, no signs, no anything. I find a few problems with that perspective. Number one, I want you to know first and foremost, and I don't want anyone to misunderstand me on this, on what I'm about to say next. There is absolutely a rapture. We can call it the resurrection if you want. We can call it the snatching away, the harpazo, which is the Greek term. The rapture is borrowed from the Latin term raptura or rapture, something like that. It's the English version, rapture. But there absolutely is what Paul terms in his letters to the Thessalonians, a blessed hope, where we who are either alive or those who died before Christ comes back, doesn't matter, we will be caught up to meet the Lord in the air. So the great resurrection, this is our blessed hope. And that time frame, that time period, that event is not going to be secret. It will be heralded around the world by cosmic disturbances and or signs. So the disciples in Matthew 24 asked Yeshua, when will be, and they asked two aspects, when will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? The sign of your coming, that's the rapture, and of the end of the age. So there are two aspects that we're going to be looking at in time. Let's look at this chart. The rapture, according to these four views, there's what's called the pre-trib, meaning pre-tribulation rapture, as in a rapture that takes place prior to the tribulation that's going to hit planet Earth for the 7 years. And the top chart, we're looking at the left side of your chart here. Pre-trib, those folks who believe that they're not going to go through any tribulation as a Christian, that Jesus is going to suddenly and imminently rescue them from any tribulation, and they're not going to have to go through anything. That's one perspective. It's a very popular view, and it might even be the majority view in evangelical Christianity today. But moving down the chart, we have what's known as the mid-trib view, where if you look at the yellow circle known as the rapture, this places the rapture sometime in the middle, in fact, sometime right smack dab in the middle of the 7-year tribulation. See the bottom of the chart there, 7-year tribulation. So meaning if the tribulation is 7 years long, according to the mid-tribbers, you're going to have to go through 3.5 years of bad stuff. But have no fear, Jesus is going to rapture you 3.5 years into it. And then we'll talk about the wrath of God here in a moment. The Prewrath view, which is the third down from on the list on the left, it doesn't have the rapture yellow circle at the beginning or in the middle, but it's closer to the middle. It's just a little farther to the right side. It has this pink section called Wrath of Satan, and then you have the yellow circle called Rapture, and then the gray arrow pointing to the right called Wrath of God. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then finally, the bottom view on the list called Post-Trib doesn't even have the rapture at the beginning. It's the exact complete opposite, mirror opposite of the pre-trib at the very top. It takes that yellow circle and pushes it all the way to the far right, meaning you go through all of the 7 years of tribulation and the wrath of God, and then God raptures you, or Jesus raptures you. On the far right of the chart, as you can see, there's this big gray section called millennium. That is what many Bible prophecy students and teachers call the 1,000-year reign of Christ here on earth. Some people believe in a literal 1,000-year time. Some people believe that's just figurative or allegorical or a spiritual 1,000 years. There's not a physical 1,000 years. Let me tell you what my perspective is in closing for this section tonight. I fall into the section known as Prewrath on this chart, the third down. I believe that there is a 7-year literal time period that we will still experience on planet Earth one day. I don't believe the entire 7 years is labeled the tribulation, but I do believe the entire 7 years will be marked by tumultuous times. There will be persecutions, there will be suffering, there'll be plagues, there'll be unnatural disasters that take place on earth and in the skies. So there will be a lot of shaking, a whole lot of shaking going on planet Earth and in people's hearts and in their spirits, and there'll be a lot of demonic activity and such taking place during that time period, but I don't label the entire thing the tribulation. More exactly, we'll find out in subsequent teachings. The first 3.5 years is more labeled what we might call the birth pangs, what Jesus himself called the birth pangs. As if the baby giving birth is maybe near the very end of the time frame, or maybe the rapture itself might be the baby, depending on what view you take. But I take Prewrath. Prewrath, the important part to walk away with in the perspective that I hold to, is that the tribulation is something that we believers will go through, because there will be distress on planet Earth, and we will go through the pink period known as the wrath of Satan, where Satan has been given a short space by God himself to just go out and persecute Christians, to actually make war with the saints and to overcome them. This is language you find both in the Old Testament prophecies, such as Daniel, as well as in John's Revelations, like right in the middle, right around chapter 12 of Revelation, we talks about the devil making war with the saints, chapter 13 as well. So I believe we are going to go through some suffering, but it will primarily be suffering caused by either wicked mankind not repenting, or the wrath of, in other words, the birth pangs, and or specifically the suffering that Satan pours out on believers and the nation of Israel in specifically. That's the wrath of Satan. He's going to persecute the entire world, but for the most part, his focal point is on those who have a commitment to either God, to Yeshua, or some connection or commitment to Israel as a people group, because his intense hatred, when I say his, I mean Satan, but it's going to be using the Antichrist, the false Messiah, and other elements that we find in the book of Revelation, but it's all being driven by Satan. Satan hates God, Satan hates Messiah, but Satan also hates the Jewish people, who are God's physical body and covenant people, even if the spiritual covenant people are the body Messiah, the Christians, the Gentile Christians. But from Satan's perspective, the hatred is for both. He hates Jews and he hates Christians as well. The people he doesn't really hate are those who give their allegiance to him and worship the mark of the beast. He's going to, for the most part, not be as persecuting of those people. But Prewrath says we're going to go through the wrath of Satan. We're going to go through some pretty nasty stuff when we begin to read about this in the book of Revelation. And we're going to be raptured out of the devil's persecution. His persecution is going to be cut short. The wrath of Satan is going to be cut short by that yellow circle known as the rapture of Messiah, the second coming. And then what will be left on planet Earth will be for the wrath of God to be poured out upon Satan's kingdom and upon all those who refuse to believe that Jesus is the true Messiah and save their very souls from the wrath that's going to be poured out upon all of wicked mankind. So God is going to judge not just Satan and his kingdom and all of the wickedness, all the demonic powers that are at present in the world today, all of the false religions, all of the false ideologies and theologies and philosophies and all that other nonsense. But God is going to judge the entire world because they have rejected Messiah and God wholesale. They've rejected the word of truth, God's word. They've rejected the Holy Spirit. They said no to the author of life. They would be more willing to take the mark and save their own skin than to save their very soul from damnation. So for that reason, God has to pour his wrath out upon wicked mankind. And the termination of that wrath, where you see the arrow coming to an end, would be the time period of Armageddon, the end of the 70th week, the end of the times of the Gentiles, the bringing in. We're going to have to talk about what happens to unsaved Israel at the time. Where is she in this whole picture? I'm not going to tell you just right now. We'll talk about that in time. But for now, here's the overview, a preview, a snapshot, a trailer of what some of the events that we're going to be talking about in the book of Revelation. But in closing, this study is not going to be all about the rapture. Okay, so there are a lot of other end time events that we have to discuss. Talking about where Israel's salvation fits into the picture. That's not dealing with the rapture. We're going to talk about some of the campaigns of surrounding of Israel by certain armies when we get to the book of Revelation, and using the Old Testament as our backdrop. And then also an extremely important yet confusing discussion will take place farther on down into my study, where we're going to take at least 2 weeks or longer, where we're going to try to ascertain who or what is Mystery Babylon, or Babylon the Great, the Mystery Babylon the Great in Revelation chapter 17 and 18, and why that should matter to us. Because there are many views that put Revelation 17 and 18 as referring to some end-time city such as Rome, or the Vatican City, or Mecca, or Dubai, or Qatar, or Abu Dhabi, or some great big city, a modern city. Could be Jerusalem, could be a rebuilt Babylon, could be New York, could be Sydney, Australia, could be London, right? A great city could be Singapore, could be Hong Kong, right? Because it's described as a seaport in Revelation chapter 18. So we're kind of trying to ascertain what details are given to us in the Bible that can help us come to a better understanding of who might we be dealing with and why. On the one hand, it doesn't really matter, right? Because according to most of these rapture views, it won't affect us who this Mystery Babylon is. But to some extent, it should matter to us because, number one, it's a part of the Bible. And number two, it also helps us to better gain an appreciation and understanding of the book of Revelation as a whole, if we can understand some of the power-based structure of where Satan's going to be doing a lot of these things and how it affects Israel, and how it can help us pray for friends and family members who are not just here in the countries that we live in, but perhaps maybe we have friends and family members who live in the Middle East or Europe or Turkey, or believers that live in Saudi Arabia and things like that. They're going to be going through a much harder time because they're going to be closer to the epicenter of these events anyway. So that'll do it for Eschatology, a biblical study of end time events. If you can do so, stick around for the next 30 minutes apologetic section, where we're going to be talking about Trinitarian versus Biblical unit beliefs. Okay?